Much for coming out. Lovely spring evening, so it's finally here, spring. So yeah, I'm really happy to share some of these studies and results with you. So as you mentioned, over the last 20 years, it's become a really exciting field. We've learned a lot, and we also need to learn so much more, right? So today we're going to be discussing just a very broad overview of the last 20 years, some of the most salient research organized in some particular way. And yeah, as we go along, if you have any questions, you notice anything off, raise your hand and we'll stop and we'll listen to you, okay? So, okay. So maybe before I even start, I'll tell you a little bit about my story and how I ended up coming across this field. So about, let me think now, 12, 13 years ago, I stumbled upon meditation practice. I was doing my master's in Buddhist studies, and I'm really a scientist at heart, right? So I tend to try to understand things. How does this thing actually work? If there is a subjective experience, what's happening in our brains? And if there is any benefits to mindfulness, can we quantify it? And we can actually show what those benefits are. After all, there shouldn't be any conflict there. If there's something to be shown, any benefit to be gained from a 2,000-year-old tradition, or depending on your tradition even older, we should be able to tap into it and actually get to something, right? And so that's kind of my perspective from that point. I'm coming from a practitioner side, but also with a bit more critical scientific mind, if you will. So what I'll do, I'll just talk about 4 things super quickly. Just touch on the history, how we come to today. A little bit where we are now, some of the key findings. I'll try to define meditation, and for the purpose of this talk, I'll just focus on mindfulness, but of course that is not by any means the only form of meditation practice out there. And then I'll talk about 4 key brain mechanisms, okay? And again, if at any point, any questions, just raise your hand, we'll stop, we'll go from there. And before I start, are there any neuroanatomists here? Neuroanatomist? Any medical doctor, neurologist, neuroscientist? No? Close? Close. Okay, what is the background then? What's your background? Psychology. Psychology, yeah. Okay, so you're writing here. All right, great. Anyone else with a sort of scientific background of sorts? No? Yes? Social science. Yeah, it's a science. Yeah, of course. All right, so that's good. I always like knowing who I'm talking to, because I could be talking to a room full of neurologists and then I'm just embarrassing myself, right? So just want to make sure. Okay, so with those couple of things in mind, all right, so the first sort of scientific studies on meditation, not even mindfulness, just meditation, came around in the 1960s, 1970s. Would anyone know or be old enough to remember what meditation was popular around those times? Psychedelics? Yeah, psychedelics, but that's more of not a form of meditation. Anyone else? Zen, yeah. So in the 1960s, there was this massive wave of transcendental meditation they called TM. And so a lot of work in the 60s and 70s revolved around that. And especially sort of toward the late 70s, you can see a tiny peak there, tiny bump, right? And that's what that was. Now, at the time, meditation was woo-woo science and no one believed. And unfortunately, a lot of those studies were not very well conducted, not randomized controlled trials like we have today. And so the community grew very skeptical and critical of meditation research. And in fact, It wasn't until a bit later John Kabat-Zinn came around and put a new spin to it by working, introducing mindfulness, this 8-week program, and institutionalizing it in the hospital setting with chronic pain patients. So it wasn't until around then that people started to listen, first from the sort of medical field, and eventually started flirting with academia. So Richard Davidson, in the early 1990s, 1992, began a dialogue with the Holy Dalai Lama. And from then on, the community kind of began to expand, right? So you can see in the 90s and the 2000s, we began to see this kind of increase in research. I just want to point one thing out. So in dark black, solid black, that's the original scientific articles or journals, right? And you can see around maybe 2000, we have still maybe 150, less than 200 published every year, right? Meanwhile, if you look at the media coverage of those studies, it far exceeds that, right? It's more than double. Right? So for every article being written in scientific journals, there's 2 or 3 in the media, right? Sometimes good, sometimes not so good, but that is sort of the trend, right? And then into the early 2000s, this field began to grow. And so by the 2010s or so, it's entered mainstream. Everyone's heard about mindfulness. And we began to learn a whole lot more. So by now, I mean, this is from 2015. At the time, there were around 1,200 or so scientific studies and over 35,000 popular media coverage a year. Okay, so it really, really exploded. And that trend has continued to grow since then.
Question?
Yes?
This is per year, right?
Yes, per year.
For this,
Yes, this is not cumulative, this is per year.
Yeah.
So it's just, massive number. Okay, so where are we sort of today? Well, today is officially endorsed by a number of organizations, the American Psychiatric Association, NIH in the UK, endorsed mindfulness, meditation, and meditation as a form for treating depression, for example. So in the UK, you can actually go to your doctor and be prescribed meditation as a program, as a way of doing this. I don't know what it's like in Sweden. Maybe it is also the case. But in the UK, that is the case, and is government funded, right? We got to the point where this is not just some kind of hype around it. People looked at the studies, randomized trial against antidepressants or others, and it turned out to be quite effective. So the government turned around and said, like, okay, well, we need to start doing this. This is good for people. Likewise, standard psychotherapy is found to be so you just said that in NIH in the UK. It has become part of standard education for approximately 6,000 school children in London. That's 2015. I think that number is double or triple now. And around 8% of US adults report actively practicing some form of meditation. That's 2017. Right? If you look at the more popular uses of this, I mean, there are over 1,000 mindfulness apps today, over 30 million downloads. It's included in Google's business practices, right? And it has actually become a massive industry. I mean, there's over $1 billion being spent in mindfulness-based apps, mindfulness-based programs, and so on, and that's 2016, right? I'm not sure what the number is today. So, I mean, needless to say, it has really, really exploded. But what I'm actually interested in is thinking about the science behind it. Is it really worth all that, endorsement? And any questions before? No? Okay, now I'm going a little bit fast here, but I just want to get through some neuroscience stuff. All right, so before we begin with anything, most research studies conducted today on meditation speak about mindfulness. usually an 8-week program based on Kabat-Zinn's work, but there are others as well. But in general, most studies you're likely to find talk about mindfulness, right? Mindfulness meditation. So it is really important to define what mindfulness means, right? The reason why is because we can talk about mindfulness, we can even have different mindfulness practices and be doing completely different things, right? And this can lead to misinformation, misrepresentation, inappropriate comparisons. You're comparing one study versus another. Are you really talking about the same thing? And this can ultimately mislead, harm, and disappoint people, right? When we say mindfulness programs work, well, which programs, right? Which practices work? Which practices don't work, right? And even when we talk about mindfulness programs, like this 8-week program working, what aspects are actually working, are actually functional? All right, so I'll give you a pretty standard definition of mindfulness, which it's by no means the only definition, but so mindfulness people think of as the moment-to-moment awareness cultivated by paying attention in a specific way in the present moment as non-reactively, not judgmentally, open-heartedly as possible. Does that relate to you guys? Yeah? Is there any part of that definition that is a bit foreign or that you don't identify with or that you don't understand?
Yeah, I think as possible according to whom? The subject himself or?
Yeah, I mean, so that's a great question. According to whom? So this is the definition that John Kabat-Zinn brought in the 90s. Each one of these points, you're completely right, can be understood in different ways. We can have different working definitions for what it means to be aware, to be non-judgmental, non-reactive. But without getting lost in the definition of it, this is just roughly the term. So we are in the present moment, being aware, paying attention in a specific way, so not just paying attention for the sake of attention, but we are paying attention so that we don't react to what's happening around us, right? In a non-judgmental way, we just observe what's happening and open-heartedly, right? And I think that's key, actually, because that means we're not just neutral towards the experience, but we're open to it. We invite in the experience, whatever it is. Whether it's positive or negative, we're not judging. We're just present, right? Does that make sense? A bit bad? Okay. So, as you were pointing out, there's multiple faculties, many different items here. And unfortunately, there is no consensus as to what each one of those means in detail. So we have to take this definition somewhat with a wavy hand, okay? Does that make sense? So it's still a personal experience. There's a huge element of subjectivity every time we talk about mindfulness meditation, okay? Right. And then there is this issue of self-report versus actual practice, right? Can we be mindful if we don't have a mindfulness practice? Right? Probably, so people say yes, I would say yes. Or do we have to practice mindfulness in order to be mindful, right? Perhaps there is an underlying mindfulness to everything we do already, and we just can improve on it, okay? So those are kind of open questions I just leave out there. But yeah, okay. So let's move on to neuroscience if there's no questions. So there are 4 brain regions that I will talk about to keep it really simple. The prefrontal cortex, which is sort of this biggest part of the brain, the latest in the evolution line of development for the human brain. After that is the anterior cingulate cortex, which if you kind of take your brain and split into 2 halves, if you look at the inner part of it, you will see this little ridge there, and we call that the cingulate cortex. The more sort of forward part of it, we call that the anterior cingulate cortex. Okay, and we'll see it's related to attention and conflict management. Okay, then the amygdala, or I should say amygdalae, or amygdala complex. So it's actually two little things, right? Almond shape, nuclei sort of really kind of deep in the middle of the brain. They used to be believed or talked about in terms of this limbic system. I think more modern takes on the brain and your anatomy don't really think of something called the limbic system as such, but still we have a region that is related to a number of arousal, fear, excitement, and that is the amygdala. We'll talk about that. And finally, the insula, which I couldn't get a really pretty picture of it, but the word insula means island. So if you were to kind of peer into the side of your brain and open a little bit, kind of like here, you will find this little protrusion there, which is still part of the cortex, and is being involved in all kinds of body awareness, interoception, and we'll talk about that. So those four regions you'll be seeing. So I just wanted to present that in case yes, go ahead.
Is it insula on both sides?
Yes, I should say this is bilateral, so you have a left insula and right insula. As well for amygdala, you saw left and right. Cingulate cortex as well, we have left and right on both sides of the inner medial part of the brain, right? Okay, all right, everyone on board? Just four regions, okay? All right. So four regions, and I'll talk about four brain mechanisms, right? Attention regulation, body awareness, emotion regulation, and last, self-perspective. Okay. All right, so what I'll do is I'll go through each one of those. I'll talk a little bit about what it means, some of the mechanisms involved, and how mindfulness or meditation affects that part of the brain. Okay. All right. Any questions before I move on? Great. Okay, so the first is attention regulation. And the easiest way to relate to this concept is to actually think of, if you have a mindfulness practice, you often hear things like in the instructions, sort of focus on your incoming and outgoing breath, try to sustain your attention there without distraction. If you get distracted, calmly return your attention to the breath and start again, right? So I think if you ever try meditation, this is sort of a common instruction that you're given, yeah? Has anyone experienced a different instruction that you think might also be related to this in your practice? No? So yeah, the breath, I think across tradition is sort of this anchor that is extremely useful, right? But it is not the only anchor, right? We can do single pointed attention. We can pay attention to maybe an image, for example, a sound, a sensation, right? And it's the same thing, right? So we pay attention to it. We get distracted, our mind starts to wander. We notice that our mind wandering or that we're distracted, and we come back to that item or focus, right? So very simple instruction, and that in the neuroscience and psychology perspective, we call that executive attention regulation. The word executive meaning that you are having an impact on it. It's not the kind of attention where someone breaks into the door and then you turn around, or that, you know, an alarm goes off and you pay attention to it. It's not that kind of attention. It's a kind of attention that you're willfully putting on something. Okay?
I can ask you?
Yes.
Perhaps you will come to that. I mean, this is, like you say, attention towards anchor, is breath in this case.
Yes.
Would you say, in the science of this neuroscience, is it the same result? I mean, now perhaps we will come to that. If you use a breath or you use a sound, mantra, or something else, is it the same? If you do this, could you change the breath to
a sound? Yeah, so that's a great question. So it does change, right? So there are common elements to executive attention, but the item, or I said the object that you're paying attention to has a nature to it. So if it's a sound, it will activate the auditory cortex, for example. If it's an image, it will likely activate the visual cortex. But the critical thing in neuroscience is that we think that there is a network that, regardless of the medium of the stimulus, is present when you're paying attention. Right? So same underlying attention network, different brain mechanisms adjusted to that particular medium, whether it's sound or image or others. Yeah.
Just a comment. When you say mantra, I think it's good to say that the mantra, as I see it, is not actually sound. It's because you never hear it basically. It's the first time, like when you can hear it, but then it's just a knowing. Say.
Yeah.
It's very extremely subtle. It's not a sound that you hear.
That's interesting.
Yeah, it's a knowing about something. So it's extremely subtle.
That's great. Yeah. I mean, I'm sure someone, if they haven't done, someone will do a research study on that. Fascinating. Okay. So, all right. So, attention regulation and the anterior cingulate cortex. So, the anterior cingulate cortex, this region of the brain, support executive attention, as I mentioned, but it does so by detecting conflicts. So when distracting events or thoughts conflict with the task goals. So this conflict resolution refers to the fact that we are trying to pay attention to something, let's say the breath, and then we become distracted. And then we become aware, oh, I'm distracted. I'm not paying attention to what I'm supposed to be paying attention. And that right there is this conflict. What I'm paying attention to versus what I want to pay attention to. When you're paying attention to, go ahead.
How does alcohol do with this area?
Yeah, so alcohol completely disrupts the function of this, or really diminishes our capacity to focus. So try not to meditate while drunk, if you can. Okay. So this region becomes activated every time we notice that we are basically lost. There's a disconflict, and we're not paying attention to what we want to be paying attention to, right? So essentially, it's sort of an alarm system in the brain. Every time we paying attention to what we want, this area goes up and it goes to not paying attention, go back to the object of focus, right? So it contributes to this sustained attention ability. And critically, it has been shown that we have an attentional or enhanced attentional performance in meditators. And if you notice, this is not the anterior cingulate cortex in this picture, but that one instead. So I kind of tricked you a little bit. I don't know if you guys saw that, but this area highlighted here is actually the cerebellum. Okay, so do it again. So anterior cingulate cortex, inner part of the brain, sort of a bit more forward towards the front. Okay. All right. Sorry to throw you off there. All right. Yes.
I read an article about these elements regulating our digestion systems and our heart system and our breath system. And what I start to figure out when I've been doing this practicing of being aware, it's like, could it be a filter of input to the brain of how rich experience or the valuation of the experience you can have inside of yourself if you practice consciousness about what you're eating, how you relate to your heart in different situations, and how you are.
Yeah, absolutely. You're actually one slide ahead. We're gonna get to that in just one moment, but you're just okay. So let me just before I get to that, which is in a couple of slides, I'll just show you a couple of images here on research. So meditators show greater rostrals or more forward activity in this region, as it shows here. And this is a bit puzzling. So, however, experienced meditators, and this is extremely experienced meditators with 50,000 hours or so of meditation, show decreased activity in this region, right? So I'll repeat that again. So meditators show increased activity in this region, but extremely experienced meditators show decreased activity. And you can actually see in this picture here, so from complete novices in dark blue to beginner meditators to sort of experienced meditators to long-term or experienced meditators, you see an increase. And all of a sudden, towards the end, you see people with 50,000 hours of meditation, and you see this decrease. Can anyone guess why that might be? Yes?
Because I don't have to use that anymore. I've gone beyond that. I've got focus.
Okay. And so there's something to that, yes?
I think in the previous slide there was something about top-down approach.
Well,
So is this becoming more like automatic, that you don't have to use that top-down approach?
we'll talk about that. So the truth is, we don't know exactly why. But the leading hypothesis is the following, okay? So we know that very, very experienced meditators, in fact, experience very little distraction. When their ability to focus is such that if they don't want to get distracted, they just don't get distracted, right? So they have extremely strong attention, and they also have increased cortical thickness. So the neurons in that region, that brain, has actually gotten thicker, right? And you can see here, so what we think, or researchers think, is that, for one thing, they're experiencing very little conflict, and even when they experience conflict, this part of the brain is like this really strong muscle that it just needs to flex a tiny bit and then adjust itself, right? Versus beginning meditators that have to take a lot of effort in putting this to work. Does that make sense? So anyway, that's the leading hypothesis, but perhaps we don't really know. Okay? Any questions? Yes?
With mindlessness, with really experienced meditators, have people checked at that?
Yes, and we'll get to that as well. Yes, so we're gonna look at a couple of mind wonder studies. Yes?
So you tricked us, what did you say?
Oh no, I tricked you earlier when I showed you a different area of the brain. But there's no trick here. This is when we, as much as we know. Okay? So I'll just move on to the next bit, is on body awareness. Okay? Now, again, very simple instruction. When you're doing body scanning, if you try that, you probably hear something like, notice the sensations that arise in your body. Very simple instruction, right? Just open awareness, see what's happening in your body, maybe a tingling sensation, maybe a tiny bit of discomfort, but do nothing about it, right? Just observe it. Okay? Can everyone relate to that? Some level? Okay, and by the way, I mean, this is in a meditation context, but I think we generally, hopefully, have some general ability to be aware of the sensations in our body, right? And meditation is just about making that muscle stronger, more subtle. Okay. So one area that you might have heard of is this somatosensory cortex in this part of the brain, which basically maps body sensations. So when you touch a specific part of your brain, of your body, sorry, this part of your brain lights up. Okay, but that's not what we're talking about here. What we're talking about is your awareness of those sensations. Okay, and in the neuroscience and psychology language, we call that interoceptive awareness, interoception. So the ability to be aware of specific sensations anywhere on your body, okay? And, sorry. And again, meditation or meditators have show enhanced body awareness. So they're more aware of what's happening in their bodies, subtle sensations, heart rate fluctuations, resting heart rate, your breathing rate. You're just more aware of these temperature changes and so on. Okay. And so as I mentioned earlier, so the insula is this part of the brain. So it's, if you open up a little bit, there's this little island that is there bilaterally, both sides. And meditators show increased activation after a 8-week program, so a mindfulness-based stress reduction program. They also show higher activity for processing pain, and we'll talk about that in the next slide. They show also great activation specifically in the right anterior insula to sad movie clips. So when they watch something, a sad movie film, this area comes up. It's as though they have a physiological body sensation to it, and they become aware of it. And again, very experienced meditators show greater cortical thickness, so kind of a stronger, more growth part of this brain, greater gray matter concentration in the right anterior insula. But then, again, notice that this is with experienced meditators, and this doesn't seem to be the case after just 8 weeks of MBSR. So good news, if you do 8 weeks of MBSR, you are exercising your muscle, but if you actually want to see some changes that you can detect in terms of your, I guess, structural brain, it may actually take a bit longer to manifest, right? Just like you would expect, yes?
How long do these changes last for? Do they know based on this?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I don't know, because most experienced meditators don't stop meditating. So we don't know, right? But that's a great question, right? I mean, it's very likely that it's kind of like going to the gym, right? If you do legs every day for 5 years, you have very strong legs, muscular legs. If you stop all of a sudden, do nothing, those muscles will probably shrink, right? But I mean, I'm just speculating here. Yes?
But I've seen some study that when they did for novice meditators, that they were surprisingly, after a long time, still changes left in their. But that was just.
Yeah.
Didn't hear the study.
Yeah. So there are a number of studies showing some neuroplastic changes, both in function and also structure, after short periods of meditation. There's a lot of work around that. So they are, I mean, effectively every time you do something, you meditate, there's a structural change, but it's just very hard to detect, right? How long do they last, neuroplasticity? That's a hard question to answer. But then you might see some prolonged term changes. Yeah.
Is insula something to do with empathy? You're talking about pain and also sadness.
Yeah, it has a lot to do with empathy. And actually, maybe I'll discuss that together with this slide, okay? So I just wanted to show you guys this study on meditation and resilience, but for that matter, it could be meditation and empathy, and I'll tell you why. So they did this experiment where they have meditators, whether novices or experts, in the brain scanner, and they had a water bucket in there, and they submerged their hands. And the critical thing is they could change the temperature of the water, right? So they could increase the temperature until it was hot enough that it was painful, not to burn them, but enough to, cause a bit of pain, right? And they were interested in seeing whether there are any changes or any difference in the brain, how brain reacts to pain from novices or non-meditators to experienced meditators. And so they had this condition where they had people just wetting their hand in the bucket, and then at one point, at time 0, they increased the temperature so that it was warm, okay? And sometimes they kept the water just warm, right? And that is in orange there, in the dotted line. But sometimes after a few seconds, about 10 seconds, they would increase the temperature even more, okay? So it was actually painful. And it did this in sort of randomized ways where people couldn't really predict if it was warm, it was going to get hot. So they could only know it's warm, it could get hot or not. It could be painful or not, right? And then the line above is the activity in this insula part of the brain. And what you would expect is, as with pain or with increased sensation, the activity in this in region would increase, and that's what you see, for example, for all of them. Basically, when the water is warm and hot, you see increase in this activation in this area. But if you look in the green and blue there, there's the top one, right? It does is novices, people with little or no meditation experience, and you can see right away, as soon as they put the hand in there, the brain is already overstimulating. When you add a bit of heat to it, it's even more so. And there's no distinction really between warm and hot, right? It's as though they're experiencing the pain, whether it's hot or just warm, same. If you look at the brain of the experienced meditators, you see a sharp distinction. Okay, first when it's warm, and that is in the yellow line, you see it more or less just stays warm. You don't see this peak after it gets hot, because in the warm condition, it just gets warm, right? If you're just aware of your sensation, it's just warm, it's not hot. And of course, when it gets hot, then you see this increase in response. And the critical thing is, for experienced meditators, right after they release the pain, once the pain is gone, the activity goes right back down, right? Whereas with novices and non-meditators, it stays pretty high up, right? So it's as though experienced meditators are recovering from this pain very, very quickly. And to get back to your question, they replicated this study with other conditions, such as seeing people in pain. So not experiencing pain yourself, or seeing others experiencing pain, and they see similar results. Meditators react to the pain of others in a similar way, and once that pain is gone, they recover faster, right? So the interesting thing here is whether it's physical pain or psychological pain of others, right? The response is sort of along the same lines, right? Okay, does that get to your question? Yeah.
Yeah, and also looking at this graph, the red line, so they are sort of, you could say they are in tune with reality. Could that be like a conclusion also? Because the green line, they continue experiencing the pain while the water is already...
Exactly. Yeah, and I think, totally. And I think from a psychological perspective, I think we often do that, right? We often have some kind of pain, psychological or something, and once that thing is resolved, we're still fighting it, right? We're still stuck up there, right? So I think it's interesting that this kind of mechanisms are more or less applied to our reality very much. So they translate quite well. Cool. All right.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
I found another scientist, Dr. Bruce Lipton, you know him?
Who is that?
Dr. Bruce Lipton.
I'm not so familiar. Yeah.
He talks about the cells have its own kind of memory.
Oh.
And then I have done quite practicing now, and I'm starting to sense that my cells are also not starting to get kind of aware
Huh.
and affecting me. So I'm starting to wonder, are there connections? Are there done studies and measures about what is happening?
Interesting. Tell you what, let's leave that one to the end, and then we'll try to get back to it, because otherwise we get distracted. But it's a great question. Yeah. Okay. So number 3, third brain mechanism, emotion regulation. Right. Now, most meditation practices don't have instructions around this, right? However, there's a huge body of literature from the Buddhist side of things that describe meditation dealing with this kind of emotional states, right? So just to quote Bhikkhu here, so he describes meditation as, this is the direct path to the purification of beings, for overcoming of sorrow and lamentation, and the disappearance of pain and distress, right? So I think that's a great quote, and I think it's interesting. It would be great to understand some of the science and how science can speak to that. And does anyone know what this part of the brain is? Question again? Amygdala, yes. So amygdala, again, both sides, amygdala complex, right? Now, the amygdala gets a really, really bad rep for being like the bad part of the brain. I don't know who started it, but it's not true, okay? So the amygdala does a number of amazing things for us. For one thing, it keeps us away from danger, right? Without it, we probably would be completely fearless and not become aware of any surroundings and then get in trouble. But it does a lot more than that. So aside from fear and anger, it basically processes every and any emotional experience with a high arousal state. So every time we experience excitement, the amygdala lights up. Every time we experience elation, extreme happiness, the amygdala lights up, right? So it's very short-sighted to think of amygdala as a bad guy that just lights up with fear and anger, right? So it's not the case, right? Now, now going back to meditation, research shows that there is a reduced emotional interference after 7-week programs. Emotional interference just means when you're trying to do a cognitive task, perhaps some maths or something that just involves some strategic thinking, for example. If you're experiencing an emotion at the same time, you can get distracted. It might take you longer to solve that puzzle. But 7 weeks of mindfulness meditation can actually help improve that. It can decrease negative moods, improve positive moods, reduce distraction and rumination. Okay? And at a physiological level, it actually helps you recover faster from emotional distress. And you can look at this in terms of skin conductance. So when you sweat a bit less. Yes?
Does anyone know what that word rumination means?
Oh, that's a great question. So rumination, what's the Swedish word for it? Älta. So yeah, rumination refers to any kind of repetitive thought pattern that is not necessarily directed, right? It's the kind of thing when you just sit in there and all of a sudden you notice your thoughts just going around and around. Maybe you're thinking, oh, I should have watered the flowers earlier. Why didn't I do that? And then 5 minutes later you go, I should have watered the flowers. Why didn't I do that? 10 minutes later, you do the same thing and the same thing and the same thing, right? So you're ruminating. And we're actually going to get back to that. But yeah, so is everyone familiar now with rumination or ELTA? ELTA? Okay. All right. Okay. Now, yeah, people practice meditation also see a decreased startle response by averse stimuli. So startle response means when someone surprises you, comes out of nowhere, just scares you, for example, you usually have this reaction, right? So that's a startle. People that experience meditators show a decreased experience of that. Okay, so we're less easily surprised, you could say. Right. Now, and this goes back to the point you were doing earlier with bottom-up and top-down regulation. Okay. So these two terms are kind of very trendy these days in cognitive science. So bottom-up refers to all these sort of subconscious processes that kind of come up, right? So you're walking on the street and all of a sudden you start getting agitated, or you notice someone looked at you in a strange way or something, maybe the cashier didn't smile at you, and all of a sudden you find yourself in a negative mood, right? So these things are, you're not even really aware of it to start. So these are coming from your body, and we call this bottom up, okay? Then on the other hand, we have this top-down regulation, which is associated with more of your conscious awareness and conscious choices, right? And people used to think of these two as sort of conflicting or somehow opposing forces. In reality, they're more of a working team, if you will. So bottom-up subconscious processes associated with amygdala response, for example. So you notice something, you become angry, fearful, excited, right? And if there is no top-down regulation at all, then you become overly angry or overly excited, right? And what the top-down conscious awareness does is to kind of put that into perspective, right? So the prefrontal cortex, this top-down regulation, regulates amygdala response, right? And I should probably also say that the vice versa, the opposite is also true. So amygdala can also regulate prefrontal cortex response, right? Okay. Now, people that practice meditation show increased inhibitory control. So people that experience meditation are more capable of stopping themselves from doing things. So rather than just a response, you can actually stop your impulses, and you can monitor your affective states, that is your emotional states. We see increased activation in prefrontal cortex and decreased activation in amygdala as a response to emotional experiences, for example. Okay. So that in a nutshell is sort of this interplay between top-down, bottom-up in emotion regulation. Okay. And just being mindful of time, we're almost done. Number 4, and this is sort of a different kind of line of research in a way, but it's this changed perspective of self, right? So if you practice meditation for a long time, or if you're familiar with the literature, you might have come across this idea of non-self, right? In the words of Dalai Lama, he says, this seemingly solid, concrete, independent, self-instituting me or I that is under its own power appears, right, actually does not exist at all, right? So what this is saying is that this kind of notion of me or I that we so strongly believe, and it has its own power and it appears, Dalai Lama says, it doesn't exist. What does that mean? And from a neuroscience perspective, how can we begin to look at this question, right? After all, the sense of me, I, is extremely subjective. Who are you to tell me I'm not me, I'm not I? How can we explore this, okay? And in order to do that, there is a line of research that explores the neural networks and what happens when we do different activities, right? One of these neural networks, and by neural network I just mean different parts of the brain that activate together or they have some kind of corresponding interaction that play together. So one of this is the default mode network, or just default network for short. And this is the network shown here that becomes active every time we're ruminating, we are mind-wandering, and is involved in self-referential thought. Okay, so any thoughts relating to the self, and if you think about it, so I've done this in the brain scanner. We put people in the brain scanner, and we tell people instructions for this particular task is let your mind wander. And the interesting thing is when you do this afterwards, you interview the person, what were you thinking about? And they were like, well, I was thinking about how I could do this or my this, and it's always related to the self, right? Now, as we noted, so with mindfulness practice, a lot of meditation is about not focusing on yourself, but just focusing on the experience, right? Whether you happen to be in the experience or not, or you think of yourself as a strong me, I'm listening or not, they're just the listening. They're just the feeling, right? And so there has been a number of studies that show that non-judgmentally experiencing these meditation states can actually change our perception of self. And we can actually have these different states where we can kind of detach ourselves from the experience and just experience the activities for themselves. So some people call that reperceiving, some people call that decentering. But whatever you call it, basically leads to a change of self-perception. And meditation practice, it typically leads to positive self-perception, positive self-esteem, and acceptance above all. Okay. And a number of studies show that changing your perspective of self towards this positive frame might actually be key to this authentic, enduring happiness. Right? So it's more than just a psychological or philosophical exercise. There are real implications of adopting and practicing and seeing these changes in self-perception. Okay? Does that make sense to you guys? Or is that completely lost? Yes?
How does that happen? Because I can imagine that in meditation when you, for instance, are mindful of mental events as just mental events, but how about then other types of meditations when you're actually constructing another self by meditating on compassion or...
Yeah, so there is some difference. Let me show you this study. Maybe it gets to your question a little bit. We won't specifically get to talk about compassion, but maybe in a future talk we can. But I just wanted to show you this study here. So in this study, people were instructed to do one of two things. Thing number one, ruminate, mind wander, do whatever you want. Let your mind just do itself. Thing number two, just pay attention to your body, to your awareness of your body. Okay? Meditate, body awareness. Okay? And what they saw was that for meditators and controls, so people meditating or mind wandering, there was a key distinction in the pattern of brain activity, specifically along the midline, or this kind of middle part of the brain. So self-referential processes activate the midline brain structures. So medial prefrontal cortex, that's toward the front, posterior cingulate cortex, and inferior parietal lobule. So these regions of the brain activate when we have the self-referential thought. And critically, for meditators in the meditation condition, this activation was actually reduced, it was decreased, okay? So we know that mindfulness practice, mindfulness meditation decreases activity in this default mode network. We know that there is greater functional connectivity within the default mode network for meditators, suggesting that maybe there's increased conflict monitoring and cognitive control. Okay. All right. So after all, it does seem that meditation disrupts this self-referential network by reducing the activity, right? Okay. Questions? Answers? Okay. All right, so just in the interest of time, one final slide and then we can take a few questions. Okay, cool. So this is Mathieu Ricard. Has anyone come across him before? He is a remarkable person. He is a French chemist by training. Some point 40, 50 years ago, maybe longer, I'm not sure. He turned to meditation practice, and then in the early 1990s, together with Richard Davidson, they started this dialogue for bringing science, neuroscience, into the meditation hall, if you will. So a lot of this work has been thanks to people like him. Okay? So if I can get you guys to take one thing as anything out of this talk is basically this. So think of your mind as a gym, okay? Your brain is a muscle, and meditation practice as exercise. That's literally it. Okay. Meditation will quite literally strengthen your brain. The regions we saw is strengthen the networks, physically change the structure over time. And just like exercise, if you stop, then you lose some of those benefits. So it's not the kind of thing that you do once and then you stop. You need to make it into a habit, do a practice. I introduced my roommate to meditation a few years ago, and he actually went to a meditation retreat just a few years ago. And the last time I talked to him about meditation, he said, "Oh yeah, no, I've already done that." I was like, "Man, I got nothing through to you." So this time I just wanted to mention this and make sure that kind of got across. Okay, and just like anything, the more you practice, the stronger you get, so go exercise. All right, so thank you. All right. All right.
Some books in the bookshop here on Friday.
Oh yes, I think, yeah, he's published a few books, so some of might do that. All right, so thank you. That's my email. If you have any questions, I do some work with potential projects. They do some wonderful work about introducing mindfulness practice into the workplace, so it's very interesting work they do. All right, any questions, comments, complaints? Yes?
Many of the pictures are from fMRI scanners, right?
Yes.
What does the F stand for? So it stands for functional.
Yeah.
I mean, the rest is magnetic resonance.
Yeah, so
What does it mean functional?
So there's basically a few kinds of brain scans that you can do. You can do a structural brain scan where you just look at the structure, how is the brain configured, those different regions. But you can do a functional, and when it's functional, we think about the blood that is being directed when something becomes active. So just like a muscle, when you're using it, you direct blood to it, and those neurons actually use this oxygen and they fire up, per se. And so the brain scanner in a functional brain scan detects this blood flow, and we can know which areas are being active, are actually using this oxygen. So that's why it's functional. Yeah. Cool. Questions? Oh, yes?
So, do you know if there have been any kind of research in this with this cell and these relationships?
So the short answer is no. Now the long answer is that, you know, we think of the nervous system, most people think of it as just the brain, right, this part from the neck up. But in reality, we have neurons throughout our bodies. We have neurons in our stomachs, in our muscles, right? And we've really only begun to understand the relationship between the brain and the rest of the neurons, the rest of the nervous system. So whether there is a lot of impacts, effects on the rest of the physiology, there sure are. But I think we're still very, very far from understanding that.
You can say that I'm experiencing more and more connection with myself than I do Shivasa in yoga.
Amazing.
So I'm starting to wonder, you know, it's, what is actually going on.
Yeah, so I think it's great. So awareness of your body, those, I mean, physical connections and networks that project to the rest of your body from your brain, your spinal cord, can become stronger, right?
It seems to be like an inspiration by the book of, a friend gave me a book about how the cell function, and that was kind of stimulating that kind of growth of awareness.
Yeah.
And then there were other people giving me books about our body systems. So by having some kind of referential point to something that feels probably relevant for the self, or to take, can increase, for me it seems to increase the meditation effects or the self-awareness by having different kinds of reference points that seems to have a kind of a relevance for this inner thing, whatever it is.
Yeah.
So that is what I start to see can be like a guiding by using things that, yeah, okay, I have a heart, I have a mind, I have different parts, and that we can relate to, and I have cells, and that seems to be giving some kind of ability to let go of certain things.
Yeah, I think that's great. I mean, the relationship to the body, you know, it's fantastic. Yeah, amazing. Yeah.
On the same lines, I've experienced that, you know, when people start meditating, they usually get a lot of pain in their body, in the knees or the back or whatever.
Yeah.
But then, when people develop more concentration, more experienced meditators don't have much pain for some reason.
Yeah. So it's a great area of research. So as I mentioned, the first kind of view of mindfulness from a scientific perspective was on pain and effects on chronic pain patients. And the findings were really, really interesting. So most patients came in thinking, I want to get rid of my pain. I'm in pain and I want it gone. Give me some meds. And so when John Kabat-Zinn came in, he didn't bring a painkiller in that way. He brought this practice which didn't get rid of the pain. And afterwards, many studies show that are people experiencing pain? Yes. And how intense is this pain? 8 out of 10, 10 out of 10. After meditation practice, guess what? You think it's higher or lower?
I think it depends on the type of meditation
Okay.
and how long they practice.
Yeah, so in this case, for 8-week mindfulness programs, the pain was just as much as it was before. And yet, something changed. When you ask these people, how much does this pain bother you? Before it was like a 10 out of 10. Now it's like a 7. After more time, it's a 4. It's a 3. So it's not that you decrease the pain. It's that your pain tolerance, how much it bothers you, increase a lot. Yep.
And that probably has something to do with acceptance.
Absolutely. Yeah.
They don't have resistance.
Yeah. Yeah, and also not fighting so much, but actually just being there. And from Buddhist perspective, we know there's 2 pains. There's the physical pain, and then there's your psychological pain, right? Why do I have this pain? What do I need to do to get rid of? Oh, there is the pain again. So it's like we have an arrow, and then we stick another one ourselves. Right? So we can get rid of one, that's already really good, and then we can accept that. In that sense, it reduces our pain.
It seems that they're shifting, as you're practicing, they're shifting, depending on where you are in a kind of own awareness.
Yes.
I myself have had lots of injuries on my legs and car accidents.
Okay.
So I feel like, for example, I had a problem with this leg, and when that is starting to restore, then it is like the other one is starting to resist the change. So then he take over and are trying to get me back to the position I was before. So it seems that there are layers that have depending on the history. So if you have had a car accident, like, okay, I drag his shoulder out the window, then it is kind of resisting, you want to stay here.
Yeah.
So when you're doing the yoga and pulling it back, then this one say that it is not good. Then after a while they will shift roles.
Yeah.
So if you are starting to be aware of these conflicts, then you can let go of them, and then it will not be a problem.
Yes.
So that is what I have experienced, because I've been trying to use the yoga to correct these things, and then I found these patterns.
Yeah,
starting wondering, okay, now it feels good everywhere, but then
but somewhere else.
Suddenly comes something else, and then, okay, so now it's trying to get me back to where I was.
Yeah.
And when I could let go of that, then I could go further, and then it was kind of rearranging.
Yeah.
So this kind of accidents can have very deep, because it seems that the muscles then are building memories.
Yeah.
And those memories are sending signals to the brain about.
Definitely, yeah.
And then depending on that kind of how serious it was and how long he was going with this pain. So this was like 3 months. This was like another 3 months of painkillers. That seems to create this kind of memory in the muscles or somewhere that preventing this.
Yeah, chronic pain is people think of it as learned pain, right? A lot of times, people with phantom limbs, if you ever heard of that, so people that have their arm amputated, and they still experience pain in the amputated hand, right? And extreme pain. And how can that be? Well, the pain is not here. The pain is in your brain, right? If it's learned, it's going to hurt, right? So, in fact, there's a huge line of research as to somatic and pain. Yes, go ahead.
Have like nerve things here, nerve endings that are being activated also. So it's not only in the brain.
No, you're right. I mean, it's in the nervous system, but a lot of this research shows that even when you sedate those nerves, people still experience pain. So we know it's not just the nerve ending. Otherwise, it would be different. But yeah, I mean, it's a complicated issue. Yes.
Have they looked at if an experienced meditator has an effect on people around you?
What do you mean?
Like if people close to this person, will they become more efficient in their meditation? Or like, say, a person with some psychological illness will have also an effect on someone if there's a close proximity.
You mean like physical proximity? I'm not so familiar with that line of research, so I don't know that there has been much done in that sense. But Yeah,
Because
that could
some
be.
people speak of like this area is very peaceful. It's so peaceful being with this. So I'm wondering if there's a they looked at this.
Yeah, I'm not so familiar with that. So you mean like if someone like maybe a meditation master or something and it has this space and then people come and then just become, so there's this
The placebo thing.
yeah, so there is this together with empathy and compassion, there is this idea that emotions are contagious and we have mirror neurons. So whatever someone experiences and someone smiles, you're likely to smile. So in that sense, there is a lot of research on that, yes. But I don't know specifically to meditation, but yes.
I was wondering if you could see in the brain, there's sometimes when your concentration is good or you're really aware or mindful, it seems like you can experience thoughts and sensations and feelings at the same time. It's like you're aware. You don't get lost in the thoughts. They can go on, and you're still aware of other things.
Yeah,
and then I've heard that they explain this, that it's very quick that you can't be aware of three things at the same time. It's sort of short moments.
Yeah, so there's two things I can say about that. One, so there is open awareness as a meditation practice rather than focus on ours. Open awareness is open your mind, everything that's there, just experience, right? And the idea behind that is that you just complete in a non-judgmental, accepting way, and all of these things you can become aware of, right? So in that sense, I think, and this is more on the experiential side of things, I think it is possible to become aware of many things simultaneously. Now there is another line of research, and that's the second thing, that says that as multitaskers, humans, we are terrible. We always been told like multitasking, and I'm such a great multitasker. But research shows, and again, that every time we multitask, we do worse at any of those things. If anything, we should prioritize unitasking. And if someone puts in their resume, unitasker, you should hire that person. If someone says, great at multitasking, big question mark, don't believe them. Right? But in terms of open awareness, yeah, sure, as a meditation practice for sure.
I was thinking if you could see parts of the brain.
Oh yeah, sorry.
Something like that.
Yeah, so
when you quickly change between the different things.
Yes, yes. So there is the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. I think is bilateral actually. So this area has been associated with changing attention. So from doing one thing, one task, to doing another, this area seems to be really useful for switching your attention. Yeah. So yeah, we can definitely look into that.
We should be experts to do multitasking. We're keeping our whole system running 24 hours a day. So we should be fantastic in this.
So there are two things. So there's habit formation, and then there is executive function. Executive function is the first time you learn to drive, and there's many things to take care of. You're like, look in the mirror, shifting, and then the brakes, and all over the place, and your attention is like shifting from one thing to another, and it's extremely hard. Right? But the more you drive, all of these things become simultaneously integrated to the point where they become a habit. Right? You know that if you're slowing down, you need to push the brake and gear down, for example. So in that sense, things become a habit rather than an executive function. So even though you're multitasking in a way you're unitasking because you made a habit out of it. Kind of like brushing your teeth. That makes sense?
So then if you learn different disciplines to a certain level of degree,
yes,
then you could do multitasking.
Maybe you could create a habit out of it.
I IT, so I know I can do that because I learned certain things and then you can jump between because you can solve different problems because you to have a capability. You have
Yeah.
2% of tools.
Yeah, I mean,
So then you can multitask in between different.
I think it's possible to shift from one thing to another thing. Yes. I think it's a lot harder to do two things at the same time. Try sending an email and having a conversation. Right? I think you can write an email, stop, continue with the conversation, stop the conversation, get back to your email. So in that sense, yes, but both things simultaneously tricky. Okay. So just in interest of time, I think we should be wrapping up. But yes.
Can I ask about EEG? You know, as you can measure.
Yes.
Then we talk about frequencies, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's also type of frequencies, beta, alpha.
Yeah.
Are these frequencies actually waves in terms of like sinus waves, or are they it's just a matter how to break up this structure of patterns like electricity? I mean, I imagine it's not really sinus waves, but if you put it on a frequency analyzer, you can put it as certain frequencies.
Yeah, that's correct. So
in the brain itself, it's not a sinus sort of wave, you say.
It depends who you ask. I would think that they actually, I mean, as from a mathematical perspective, I think so. I think that you have different frequencies in the brain that mean something. And this is sort of a different line of research. So everything I showed you today is fMRI, I believe. But EEG, or electroencephalography, is this technique where rather than looking at blood flow, we look at electric currents in the brain. And the idea is when a neuron becomes active, it literally fires a electric charge along, I guess, the sort of a neuron to a next neuron. And so neurons communicate with electricity, right? And when you have millions or tens of thousands of these neurons becoming active at the same time, so for example, the amygdala just becomes active because you're angry or something, it collectively sends a electrical signal to the prefrontal cortex, for example. And that's the kind of signal that the EEG can measure. And there's all kinds of properties to those signals. So what is the frequency, the time? But yes, I think, yeah, there's a huge, it's a different world into the sort of electricity of the brain. Yes. Okay. Okay. Any other questions, comments? Last minute complaints? No? All right. So thank you so much. I think that's all.
Thank you. I just wanted to make a short announcement.